The mournful wail of a saxophone cut through the evening air, startling Hans Müller awake from his uneasy slumber. For a moment he thought he was dreaming. The sound was so foreign, so unexpected behind the barbed wire of Camp Ellis that his mind couldn't process it. Around him, other German prisoners stirred in their bunks, eyes wide with confusion. Hans had been captured in Sicily during the Allied invasion, marched onto a transport ship, and sailed across the Atlantic, expecting torture, starvation, perhaps execution. Instead, as twilight settled over the Illinois prairie, the unmistakable rhythm of American jazz drifted through open windows, each note more bewildering than the last. "What kind of prison is this?" whispered Karl, a former Panzer commander, his face illuminated by moonlight streaming through barracks windows. The men crowded toward the sound, some pressing faces against wire mesh screens. Outside, beneath strings of electric bulbs that shimmered against the darkening sky, a group of American soldiers had assembled a makeshift stage. A piano, drums, saxophone, trumpet, they gleamed under the lights as the band launched into another tune, this one faster, more urgent. The music swelled and swooped, chaotic yet precise, a contradiction that seemed to embody America itself. Hans had been in the camp for just 3 days, still raw from defeat and disorientation. The journey from Sicily had been long, weeks on ships and trains, always waiting for the brutality to begin. Nazi propaganda had filled their heads with visions of American savagery. "They will work you until your hands bleed," their officers had warned. "They will starve you. They will break you." Yet here was music, floating freely through the night air, performed not for torture, but seemingly for pure pleasure. The prisoners watched in silence as off-duty guards gathered around the band, some clapping in rhythm, others dancing with awkward enthusiasm. A few soldiers produced bottles from which they drank deeply, passing them between comrades with laughter that carried across the compound. It was the laughter that disturbed Hans most of all. So casual, so unburdened. How could men at war laugh like this? How could music flow so freely in a place built to contain enemies? As the night deepened, the band played on, jumping from frantic, pulsing numbers to slow, mournful ballads that made the saxophone sound almost human in its crying. Hans felt something inside him shift uncomfortably, a first hairline crack in certainties he'd carried across the ocean. What kind of enemy plays music under open skies while the world burns? And what might it mean for everything he had been taught to believe? The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the memory of music still hanging in the air like a question none of the prisoners dared to ask aloud. Hans stood in line for breakfast, tray extended, expecting the meager rations he'd been conditioned to anticipate. Instead, American kitchen workers heaped his plate with scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, and a large cup of coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. He stared at the food in disbelief, then at the prisoners ahead of him walking away with identical bounty. "This cannot be real," muttered Dieter, a thin lieutenant from Hamburg, eyeing his tray suspiciously. "It must be for show. Tomorrow we will get gruel." The men carried their food to long tables, still expecting some trick, some cruel jest. Hans took a cautious bite of toast, the sweetness of strawberry jam exploding across his tongue. He couldn't remember the last time he'd tasted anything so rich. In Sicily, they'd survived on stale bread and whatever could be scavenged from the countryside. In Germany, rationing had been severe for years. Yet here, in captivity, breakfast arrived on clean plates, abundant and hot. After the meal, the prisoners were marched to a large field where a stocky sergeant waited. Many braced themselves. Surely now the brutal labor would begin. Instead, the sergeant gestured to a pile of equipment: baseball bats, gloves, balls. "Recreation time," he announced through an interpreter. 2 hours daily. Baseball, volleyball, or just sit if you prefer. Up to you." The prisoners exchanged glances of pure confusion. Recreation? Choice? These concepts seemed alien in the context of imprisonment. Hans wandered to the edge of the field, watching as some of the younger prisoners cautiously picked up the unfamiliar equipment, attempting to mimic the motions they'd seen guards make with the strange curved bats. Other men simply sat on benches, soaking in the autumn sunshine with expressions of bewilderment. A corporal from Berlin, Edward Schmidt, settled beside Hans, his face troubled. "It makes no sense," Edward whispered, careful not to be overheard. "We were told Americans were savages, that they would treat us worse than animals." He gestured toward the playing field. "Does this look like savagery to you?" Hans had no answer. The propaganda they'd absorbed for years had painted Americans as undisciplined, racially inferior, a chaotic mixture incapable of true strength. Yet in just 2 days, he'd seen evidence of organization, abundance, and most disturbingly, humanity. The question hung between them, unanswered, as the sound of laughter drifted across the field. German laughter, hesitant but real, as prisoners began to engage in play for the first time in years of war. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the camp, the sound began again, not from outside the compound this time, but from within. A small combo of American soldiers had set up inside the mess hall, instruments gleaming under fluorescent lights. Tables had been pushed aside to create space, and guards were casually motioning prisoners inside. Hans followed the crowd, drawn by curiosity and the magnetic pull of the music. The band was smaller tonight, just a piano, bass, drums, and a single trumpet. But the sound they produced filled the room with a warmth that seemed to push against the very concept of captivity. The trumpet player, a young black soldier with hands that seemed too large for his slender frame, coaxed sounds from his instrument that made Hans's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. The melodies were unlike anything in German classical tradition. They twisted and turned, improvised on the spot, breaking rules only to create new ones in the same breath. "Jazz," explained a guard who noticed Hans's intense focus. "This is real American music, not that stuff Hitler lets you hear." Hans nodded, though the word meant little to him. In Germany, such music had been denounced as Negermusik, degenerate sounds that corrupted Aryan purity. It had been banned, its records destroyed, its musicians persecuted. Yet here it flowed freely, even in a prison camp, as natural as air. Hans noticed something else that made his breath catch. Prisoners were being invited to sit in empty chairs at the front of the room, closer to the band. Some accepted cautiously, while others hung back, suspicious of such unexpected privilege. From his position against the wall, Hans watched as the music worked its strange magic on even the most resistant men. Feet began to tap, heads nodded in rhythm. Faces that had been locked in grim determination since capture began to soften, if only for moments. When the trumpet player launched into a slow, mournful tune that seemed to speak directly of longing for home, Hans saw something he never expected. An American guard and a German prisoner sitting side by side, both with eyes closed, both transported by the same notes to whatever distant place they each called home. How was it possible that the same music could touch both captor and captive? What did it mean about the humanity they shared beneath the uniforms that divided them? As Hans made his way back to the barracks later that night, a new thought troubled his sleep. What if everything he'd been taught about his enemies was wrong? And if that was false, what else might crumble under the weight of this new reality? "I played clarinet before the war," confessed Stefan, a bespectacled corporal who had barely spoken since their arrival at Camp Ellis. The morning sun streamed through the barracks windows as men made their bunks with military precision, a habit carried from their former lives. "In a small orchestra in Munich. Nothing professional, but—" His voice trailed off, the memory seemingly too painful to complete. "My father took me to hear American jazz once, in 1931. Another voice added. It was Werner Keller, a lieutenant who had fought in North Africa. "In Berlin, before everything changed. The band was from New Orleans. I've never heard anything like it since." His weathered face softened at the recollection. "Until last night." Throughout the barracks, similar conversations bloomed, quiet admissions of pre-war connections to music, art, literature. Things that had been buried under years of combat and ideology now rose tentatively to the surface, coaxed out by the unexpected encounter with jazz. Hans listened, struck by how the music had opened doorways to memories that war had sealed shut. "My sister married an American," whispered Otto, a tank driver from Dresden, his voice so low that only those closest could hear. "In 1936, they moved to Chicago. We were forbidden to speak of it." He paused, swallowing hard. "I wonder sometimes if she still plays piano." These fragments of shared humanity were interrupted by the arrival of a guard, a freckled young man from Kansas, who announced that volunteers were needed for farm work. "Optional labor," he emphasized through the interpreter, "paid in camp scrip you can use at the canteen. 8 hours, good conditions." Again, the concept of choice in captivity startled the prisoners. Optional work? Payment? These contradicted everything they expected. Hans joined the volunteers, partly from curiosity, partly from desire to escape the confines of the camp. They were loaded onto trucks and driven through golden fields of corn and wheat, the Illinois landscape stretching to horizons that seemed impossibly distant. The farm belonged to a man named Thomas Mitchell, whose 2 sons were fighting somewhere in Europe. This knowledge created an immediate tension. Here was a father sending his children to kill Germans, now accepting German labor on his land. Yet Mitchell showed no hostility. He demonstrated tasks clearly, provided water and shade for breaks, and at midday, his wife brought sandwiches on thick bread with slices of ham and cheese that made Hans's mouth water at the sight. When they ate together in the shade of an enormous oak tree, the silence was awkward, but not hostile. Hans noticed that Mitchell's weathered hands bore the same calluses as his father's. Another farmer, separated by an ocean and opposing sides of a conflict, neither had started. "Your English is good," Mitchell remarked to Hans during the lunch break. "Where did you learn it?" "School," Hans replied cautiously, "and my father traded with English merchants before the war." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather came from Cologne in 1872. Couldn't speak a word of English when he arrived. He gestured to the sprawling farm around them. Built all this anyway." The conversation was brief but jolting. Here was an American acknowledging German ancestry with neither pride nor shame, simply as fact. In that moment, the neat divisions of propaganda began to blur further. How many of these enemies carried German blood? How many had names changed from Schmidt to Smith, from Mueller to Miller? The complexity of America began to reveal itself in ways no military briefing had ever conveyed. As the truck returned them to camp that evening, the men were tired but carrying something besides aching muscles: camp scrip, earned through honest labor, and the disorienting experience of being treated as workers rather than prisoners. What awaited them back at camp would challenge their perceptions even further. For Saturday night in America, even in wartime, even in a POW camp, meant something none of them had been prepared to encounter. The mess hall had been transformed. Tables pushed against walls, chairs arranged in semicircles, and at the front of the room a full jazz orchestra was setting up. Not just the small combo from before, but 15 musicians with saxophones, trumpets, trombones, a piano, drums, bass, and even a clarinet. The sight of the instruments alone caused a stir among the prisoners, but what truly stunned them was the arrival of visitors. Young women from nearby towns filed into the hall, escorted by guards, but smiling and chatting with obvious excitement. They wore colorful dresses, their hair styled in the latest American fashion, perfume trailing in their wake. German prisoners stood frozen in disbelief. Women? Here? The American commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, addressed the assembly through interpreters. "Saturday night dance," he announced matter-of-factly. "Local volunteers from USO and church groups. You may observe or participate with proper behavior. Any disrespect means immediate return to barracks." He surveyed the room. "Music ends at 2200 hours. The band struck up a Glenn Miller tune, the familiar strains of In the Mood filling the hall with energy that seemed almost electric. Guards stood at intervals around the room, watchful but relaxed. Some of the younger American soldiers immediately approached the women, sweeping them onto the improvised dance floor with practiced moves. The German prisoners remained clustered together, too shocked to respond. "This cannot be real," whispered Dieter, the lieutenant from Hamburg. "They bring women to dance with their enemies? What kind of war are they fighting?" Hans watched as one brave German corporal, a former architecture student named Franz, approached an older woman who sat alone. They spoke briefly, then joined the dancers, moving awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. Other prisoners followed, tentatively stepping across invisible lines of division. Hans remained on the sidelines, but something in his chest ached at the sight. Not just the women or the dancing, but the normalcy of it all. The insistence on humanity in the midst of global conflict. The band played on, shifting from fast-paced swing to slower ballads and back again. The black trumpet player from the previous night was there, his solos soaring above the ensemble with a freedom that seemed to defy the very concept of containment. Hans found himself standing near a middle-aged woman who nodded in time to the music, a wedding ring glinting on her finger. "My husband is in the Pacific," she offered without prompting. "I volunteer because I hope someone is being kind to him, too." The simple statement carried such weight that Hans could only nod in response, words failing him entirely. The possibility that Americans might view kindness to prisoners as reciprocal protection for their own captured men had never occurred to him. As the evening progressed, more prisoners found themselves drawn into conversation and even dancing. The initial stiffness melted gradually, replaced by moments of surprising connection. Hans overheard fragments. A woman who spoke some German learned from her grandmother. A prisoner who had visited Chicago before the war shared recognition of a popular song that had somehow crossed battle lines. When the band played Stardust, a melody so hauntingly beautiful that the entire room seemed to hold its breath, Hans watched as enemies swayed together under the same spell of music. The moment felt surreal, as if the war had momentarily retreated to some distant shore, leaving behind only people caught in the same human longing for beauty and connection. How strange to find such a moment not in peace, but in captivity. How would he ever explain this to anyone who hadn't witnessed it themselves? The scale of American abundance revealed itself in layers that constantly disoriented the German prisoners. It wasn't simply the food, though that remained shocking. Fresh milk delivered daily, meat at most meals, vegetables that weren't withered from long storage. It was the casual wastefulness that truly stunned them. Guards tossed half-eaten apples into trash bins. The camp's massive kitchen disposed of leftovers without hesitation. Even the camp's electricity remained on throughout the night, lighting pathways and guard towers with a careless brilliance that made Hans think of blacked-out Thurman cities, where a single exposed bulb could bring bombing raids. "They have so much they don't even notice it," observed Carl, watching as an American private discarded a cigarette after just a few puffs. In Germany, such a butt would be carefully saved, the remaining tobacco stretched to make another precious smoke. Here, the ground around the guards' posts was littered with them, testament to plenty that bordered on indifference. The camp itself sprawled across acres, housing facilities that seemed extravagant by wartime standards. A hospital wing with X-ray machines, dental offices with modern equipment, a library stocked with thousands of books in multiple languages. The prisoners were permitted to send and receive mail, censored but regular, maintaining connections that sustained hope and identity. Each revelation added to the growing cognitive dissonance. This was not the America they had been taught to expect. Most astonishing was the camp's own radio station, broadcasting music, news, and entertainment throughout the day. While propaganda was carefully filtered, the very existence of such technology for prisoners' use contradicted everything they'd been told about American attitudes toward captives. Hans found himself lingering near speakers whenever possible, absorbing the strange cadences of American English, the advertisements for products no German had seen in years, the casual abundance implied in every broadcast. The jazz program became a particular fixture in camp life. 2 hours every evening, filling the compound with sounds that had been forbidden in Nazi Germany. The mysterious black trumpet player, whose name Hans learned was Sergeant Robert Johnson, often performed live, his music becoming a soundtrack to their strange captivity. Some prisoners began to recognize tunes, requesting favorites through guards who relayed the messages to the radio operator. In Germany, they burn this music, Edward, the corporal from Berlin, observed one evening as Louis Armstrong's voice floated through the barracks. Here, they play it for their enemies. Which country is truly free? The question hung in the air, dangerous in its implications. For men raised under strict ideology, such thoughts bordered on treasonous. Yet the evidence surrounded them. Americans permitted debate, dissent, even protest. Newspapers arriving at camp contained criticisms of their own government that would have meant death in Nazi Germany. Black and white soldiers served together, despite obvious tensions. Jews wore their faith openly. Women worked in positions of authority. One afternoon, Hans witnessed something that crystallized this contrast. An argument broke out between two guards over President Roosevelt's policies. They disagreed vehemently, voices raised, positions unmovable. Hans braced for punishment. Surely such public dissent would bring swift consequences. Instead, the men eventually shrugged, one slapping the other's shoulder before they parted ways. Disagreement unresolved, but relationship intact. "Did you see that?" Hans murmured to Werner. "They argued against their leader, and nothing happened." Werner nodded slowly, his expression troubled. In Germany, they would both be arrested for such talk. Here, it seems normal. For prisoners raised in a system where conformity was enforced through terror, this casual freedom of thought represented something more threatening than any weapon, an alternative way of existing that challenged everything they had been taught. If Americans could fight effectively while maintaining such liberties, what did that suggest about the necessity of the Reich's methods? The question formed like a splinter in the mind, impossible to ignore once lodged. The Saturday night dances became a ritual that divided the camp population. Some prisoners refused to attend, viewing participation as betrayal. Others embraced the opportunity for music, conversation, and momentary escape from the reality of defeat. The divisions often fell along generational lines. Younger men more readily adapted, while older officers maintained rigid distance. Hans found himself caught between these camps, drawn to the music but hesitant to fully engage. He often stood at the edges of the mess hall, watching as the cultural exchange unfolded before him. The band grew more experimental each week, incorporating German folk melodies into jazz arrangements, creating hybrid sounds that belonged to neither nation exclusively. Prisoners who played instruments were eventually invited to sit in, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Stefan, the former clarinet player from Munich, was among the first to cross this line. His first notes were hesitant, almost apologetic, but when Sergeant Johnson's trumpet joined in conversation with his clarinet, something magical happened. The instrument spoke a language beyond nationality, finding harmony where words might have failed. The room fell silent as the duet unfolded, every ear attuned to this unlikely collaboration. When they finished, the applause came from American and German hands alike. Stefan's face shone with an emotion Hans couldn't immediately identify. Later, he realized what he had witnessed: pure joy, something none of them had experienced in years of war. Music had temporarily freed Stefan not just from captivity, but from the weight of defeat itself. "I never thought I would play again," Stefan confessed that night in the barracks, his hands still trembling slightly. "Especially not with—" He struggled to find words that wouldn't betray too much. "They told us people like Johnson were barely human, animals. But did you hear what he can do? The soul in his playing?" He shook his head slowly. "I've studied music all my life and never achieved what comes naturally to him." The conversation hushed immediately as footsteps approached. Lieutenant Hoffman, one of the few remaining true believers, who maintained rigid Nazi discipline even in captivity. He surveyed the barracks with cold eyes, sensing the dangerous turn of thought. "Remember who you are," he said quietly. "Remember what you fight for. This American softness is designed to weaken us, to make us forget our purpose." After he passed, silence lingered. His words named the conflict brewing inside many prisoners, the growing gap between what they had been taught and what they now witnessed daily. For some, like Hoffman, retreating deeper into ideology was the only defense against cognitive collapse. For others, the foundations were already crumbling. "What if he's wrong?" a voice whispered from the darkness. "What if everything they told us was wrong? The words themselves were treasonous, yet no one moved to report them. The question had taken root in too many minds, fertilized by every unexpected kindness, every contradiction to Nazi propaganda." In the silence that followed, the distant sound of jazz floated through the night air, a soundtrack to their inner turmoil. What moral territory were they navigating, these men caught between worlds? Hans wrestled with this question as autumn deepened into winter. The camp routines continued. Work details, recreation, meals, and always the music, flowing through the compound like a river cutting new channels through rigid earth. Each prisoner responded differently to this environment, their reactions revealing inner landscapes shaped by years before the war. Hans found himself drawn increasingly to the camp library, devouring books that had been banned in Germany. Hemingway, Steinbeck, Faulkner, and black writers like Richard Wright, whose very existence contradicted Nazi racial ideology. He read histories of America that told stories wildly different from those he'd learned in school, of immigrants, including Germans, building new lives, of conflict and compromise, of ideals imperfectly realized but still strived for. "Be careful with those," warned Werner one evening, nodding toward the stack of books beside Hans's bunk. "Some might consider your curiosity a betrayal." Hans understood the warning but couldn't stop. Something was unraveling inside him, not just political beliefs, but a way of seeing the world that had been constructed layer by layer throughout his youth. The process was painful, disorienting. Some nights he lay awake, mind racing between contradictions, between what he had been and what he might become. He was not alone in this turmoil. Throughout the camp, prisoners grappled with similar questions. Some embraced the opportunity to learn English, to study American culture, to prepare for a post-war world they now suspected would not include Nazi victory. Others withdrew into tight circles of ideological purity, treating such adaptation as weakness or betrayal. The most visible division emerged around the jazz concerts, which had expanded beyond Saturday nights to include weekday performances and even music lessons offered by American band members. Those who participated were labeled traitors by some, while others saw them as pragmatists, adapting to new realities. Hans observed how quickly prison society stratified along these lines, new hierarchies forming to replace those lost in defeat. What struck him most powerfully was watching Sergeant Johnson interact with German prisoners during these sessions. The trumpet player showed infinite patience, demonstrating phrases repeatedly, celebrating small successes, treating former enemies as students rather than adversaries. One afternoon, Hans overheard Johnson explaining to Stefan why jazz required a different approach than classical music. "In Mozart, everything's written down. You play what's on the page," Johnson said, pointing to sheet music. "In jazz, the page just gives you the outline. The real music happens when you step beyond it, when you find your own voice within the structure." He demonstrated on his trumpet, playing first a structured phrase, then expanding it into something personal and unique. "Freedom with discipline," he concluded. "That's the American way." The phrase lingered in Hans's mind, freedom with discipline. It seemed to capture something essential about what he was witnessing in this strange captivity. Americans maintained order without requiring absolute conformity. They valued individual expression within collective frameworks. The contrast with German authoritarianism could not have been starker, raising uncomfortable questions about which system ultimately produced greater strength. These philosophical waters ran deeper still. If nations could be judged by how they treated their enemies, what did American handling of prisoners suggest about their moral foundation? Hans recalled the farm owner, Mitchell, who fed German workers the same food he himself ate. He thought of the women who volunteered at dances, extending kindness to men who might have killed their brothers and sons. He remembered Captain Reynolds ensuring that German prisoners received medical care equal to that of American soldiers. What kind of victory would be possible against a nation that maintained such principles even toward enemies? And if Germany had won, would they have extended similar humanity to American captives? Hans knew the answer, and it troubled his sleep. The transformation reached its zenith on Christmas Eve 1944. The camp administration had allowed elaborate preparations, a tree in each barracks, decorations crafted from available materials, even small gifts distributed through the Red Cross. The mess hall had been festooned with greenery, and extra rations, including chocolate, coffee, and cake, had been allotted for the holiday meal. As twilight fell, snow began to drift from leaden skies, transforming the camp into a scene from a winter fairy tale. Lights reflected against the white ground, softening the barbed wire's harsh geometry. After dinner, prisoners were invited to a special concert in the recreation hall. Not just the regular jazz band, but a combined orchestra of American musicians and German prisoners who had been rehearsing secretly for weeks. Hans found a seat near the back, watching as Stefan took his place among the clarinet section, his face tense with concentration. Sergeant Johnson sat in the trumpet section, conferring quietly with German brass players beside him. Captain Reynolds addressed the assembled men briefly. "Music speaks when words fail," he said, his voice translated for those who didn't understand English. "Tonight, let it remind us all of our common humanity." The concert began with Bach, familiar, structured, quintessentially German. The prisoners sat straighter in their seats, hearing the mathematical precision of their cultural heritage performed with surprising skill by the combined ensemble. Then, gradually, the program shifted. Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue built a bridge between classical and jazz idioms, its opening clarinet glissando played by Stefan with newfound confidence. By the time the full ensemble launched into swing arrangements of Christmas carols, something extraordinary had happened in the room. Enemies had become musicians together, finding harmony where discord had reigned. When the final notes of Silent Night faded, first in English, then in German, Hans noticed tears on the faces of men who had endured battlefields without weeping. As prisoners filed back to their barracks through gently falling snow, the camp seemed transformed, not just by seasonal decoration or special rations, but by something more profound. For one evening, the war had receded, revealing the possibility that what united them as humans might ultimately prove stronger than what divided them as nations. In the barracks that night, conversation flowed more freely than ever before. Men spoke of home, of childhood Christmases, of hopes for peace that now seemed possible rather than treasonous. Even Lieutenant Hoffman remained silent, perhaps recognizing that on this night at least, ideology held no power against the pull of more fundamental human connections. Hans lay awake long after lights out, listening to the soft breathing of men around him and the distant strains of music still echoing in his memory. The America he had encountered behind barbed wire bore little resemblance to the enemy he had been trained to hate. This nation of jazz and abundance, of freedom with discipline, had shown him possibilities he could not unlearn. The question that had begun as a whisper now demanded answer. What would they carry home when the war ended? Would they speak of what they had witnessed, the contradictions to everything they had been taught? Or would shame and defeat seal their lips, leaving these lessons locked behind the gates of memory? Perhaps, Hans thought, as sleep finally claimed him, the most powerful weapon America possessed was not its factories or farms, or even its military might. Perhaps it was this: the ability to transform enemies through unexpected humanity, through the universal language of music that recognized no borders or ideologies. In the soft darkness of a prison barracks on Christmas Eve, surrounded by men who had once marched under swastikas, the jazz melodies of their captors played on in dreams that no longer belonged exclusively to any nation. And in these quiet moments between sleeping and waking, a new understanding formed. That long after treaties were signed and armies disbanded, it might be these cultural exchanges, these human connections forged in the most unlikely circumstances, that would ultimately rebuild a world shattered by war. For what cannot be destroyed by bombs or bullets might still be transformed by the simple, revolutionary act of enemies making music together across the insurmountable divisions of conflict.